surrogate parents, and today we are thrilled to welcome Rebecca Davis, who is our new transition projects manager at the Federation for Children with Special Needs, and also the mother of 2 transition-age kids of her own. And she's going to talk to us today about transition planning, a bit on the focus for special education surrogate parents, but also for families who are not special education surrogate parents, because many of us are educational decision makers in one way or the other. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hello. Thank you for joining us. And thanks so much to Eileen and to the Federation for having me, and for all the parents and SCSPs out there who are going to listen to us today talk about transition planning. Next slide, please, Emma. Okay, so you probably know this, but the Federation for Children with Special Needs is the Parent Training Information Center for the state of Massachusetts. Every state has one, and actually the Federation was the first, because about 50 years ago, a mom named Martha Ziegler had the audacious notion that families could help other families. And so she piloted it, and 50 years later, we are the Federation, and I think that's pretty spectacular. Next slide, please. Our center, the transition project for the Federation, is called the Link Center, and it also falls under one of the other projects, the Parent Training and Information Center project of the Federation. We provide free information, support, technical assistance, and referrals to families, to teachers, to advocates, to SESPs, to all the professionals who work with children with disabilities and who care about them. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk on a few things about transition here. Transition, you say the word and a lot of people can look like deer in the headlights. It's a big topic, and that's why it's good to talk about it. It's good to talk about it early. In this workshop, we're going to talk briefly about transition and the law. It is legally mandated to have transition services. That's an important thing to know. We'll talk a little bit about school-based planning, what you can do with a transition planning process to help your student form a vision of his or her or their full, meaningful adult life. We'll touch on transition assessments, what they could be and what they aren't, and the IEP. We'll talk also briefly about the age of majority. We'll touch on graduation. We'll talk about the anticipated date of graduation, so that's not a surprise to anyone. And the Chapter 688 referral for some students who maybe won't be graduating with a regular diploma, but will be moving on to adult services. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, it's in the law, and usually before, I am the new transition project manager, and so for the past year, a wonderful advocate and lawyer named Leslie has been making these presentations, and she always says that it's in the law, and it's the first and very best paragraph of IDEA. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's right there, the very first paragraph. You don't even have to turn the page. The purpose of IDEA is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free and appropriate public education. And we call that FAPE, free and appropriate public education, that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So there it is right there. The 3 big goals of need: education, employment, and independent living. All 3 of those areas is critically important, and every IEP should reflect appropriate goals in each of these areas as determined necessary for each individual student. Next slide, please. Oh, and by the way, Eileen knows that she can chime in at any time with information that I have failed to give you. So I just want to let you know. We're on the same page here, Eileen? All right, very good. Okay, so it is in the law, and here's just a brief overview of the legal basis for transition planning. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it was reauthorized in 1990, and when they did that, they put in provisions for transition services. So it's been around for a while. Massachusetts, each state also has their own, so that's the federal law. There's also state law. Every state has one. For us, it's 71B. It's the Massachusetts Special Education Law, which makes it more specific and more detailed. In our special education law, we start transition services under law at the age of 14. Under IDEA, the age is actually 16. So in Massachusetts, we started a little bit earlier, which is great because for students on an IEP, we need all the time we can get to start thinking about this big transition into adult life. There's also Chapter 688, or the Turning 22 law. That's the law that makes sure that students who are not going to get a regular diploma and who are going to require adult services, that the agencies know that they're coming and that there are funds ready to help serve them. There's also the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That's where you're going to find your Section 504 information to make sure that there is not any discrimination for students and young adults with disabilities, either in the workplace or in school. And the most recent one is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014. And you may also hear people call it WIOA. WIOA became law in July of 2014, as it says, and it's designed to help job seekers who are transition age youth seek access to employment, education, training, and support services to succeed in the labor market. WIOA specifically includes provisions for something called pre-employment transition services, or PREETs, and that's specifically targeted for youth transition age. Try that again. Transition age youth with disabilities. Tripping over my own words here. 15% of MRC funding is supposed to go to PREETs. So there is money there. Those services should be free to your students, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Next slide, please. Okay, so who is eligible for transition services? As we discussed, in Massachusetts, we actually started a couple years earlier than federal law allows. We start at the age of 14. It's for students who receive special education services, which means they have an individualized education plan or an IEP, and it's for students of all disability types. Next slide, please. So what is transition planning? So you hear the word transition and you think it means a change of one stage of life to another, a change of one form of something to another. When we think about transition in the IEP process, we are thinking about transition from being a student on an IEP to taking on adult roles like independent living, employment, potentially college or vocational training, things like that. So what is transition planning? Transition planning is the ongoing process of planning for life after high school, as simple as that. And we talked about the three major goals at the end of that great paragraph in IDEA. So it's education, it's employment, and it's independent living. And so all of these aspects around a young person's life is what we start to plan for when we're talking about the IEP. Transition planning helps young adults start to envision their futures. It helps them develop a life that is meaningful to them. We're starting to focus from an IEP where we're working on trying to make things better for them or fixing things to looking at what their strengths are and what their interests are and really planning a life that way. It's important for them to have experiences in school and at home and have a variety of experiences. Next slide, please, Emma. So we can start talking about the first goal. So education. The students in the first 4 years of high school, if they can, they should be able to pursue an academic course load. If they're going to be on track to get a regular diploma, we want them to do that. So if you look at the bottom of this slide, it's important if you are on your students or your child's IEP team to read your local high school handbook, because every district might have different requirements for graduation, and you don't want to get surprised later that maybe they didn't take a class that they need, and oh my gosh, you're scrambling trying to get that diploma. So find out where usually they're online, clearly. You read it and you get your district requirements, and then you start to plan the course load for your student as they go through high school. Not every student was going to leave high school after 4 years. That's the beauty of it. Some students, if their IEP team thinks that they need extra services, they can continue. And some students are going to go on till they're 22 and they're not going to get a regular diploma. It's very, very individualized process. So when you're getting the course load, you should also be thinking about vocational interests or just hobbies. Maybe your student is interested in cooking, so they take a home ec class or a cooking class, or foods. My daughter took foods and came home with really interesting things every Tuesday. Some of them were great and some of them were very interesting. If your student likes technology, maybe there's a coding class or photography. They should use high school, use these years as a time to explore. That's what school's for. It's this great opportunity to explore things, to try things, and to fail, because you're in a safe place. So if you can encourage your child to explore and try things, I applaud you. That's what it's for. And it's not an easy thing to explore, and it's not an easy thing to say it's okay to fail, but we would give them the dignity of risk here, to let them get into school and look at things and just say it's okay if it doesn't work. But that's what life is. That's just one mom's opinion. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the second of the big goals, the big three, employment training. Let me get back to my notes so I don't forget anything. For students ages 14 to 22, yes, the IEP team, and let's make sure we include the student here. The student should be a key, if not the key, team member, because we're planning their life. So they need to start thinking about, what do they want to do with their life? Now, they're not going to know, maybe at the age of 13 or 14, what they're going to do 20 years later. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I was 14. You probably didn't either. But we're giving them a chance to start thinking about that. And for students maybe who are in a residential setting, or who are under the services of DCF, they might not get a chance to see as many different careers as other students. So we may have to actively start thinking about how to give them experiences where they get to see other careers, how to get them out in the community and have them start to think about, well, what could I be doing? That's where the beauty of the pre-ETS program comes into place. That's the pre-employment transition services, and that comes specifically through the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission. And you will hear them called pre-ETS, and you will hear the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission called MRC a lot. It's a lot of acronyms, so I like to spell it out when I can. So pre-ETS covers 5 core services: job exploration and counseling, work readiness training, work-based learning experiences, so like getting out in the community and maybe having an internship or volunteering, counseling and post-secondary education. Hopefully every school does have an MRC counselor, they're supposed to. Also self-advocacy and mentoring services. So pre-ETS programming is a pretty cool deal. The programming can take place at the school or in the community. It can occur during school hours. It depends on what the IEP team decides, and is free for the student and for the school. Remember, 15% of their budget is supposed to go to pre-ETS services, so the money is there. So hopefully when you have pre-ETS services, and also just in your IEP, your student can work on things like soft skills. These are things that aren't covered in like your academic courses, but how do you dress for an interview? How do you tie a tie if you're going to wear a tie? How do you interview? Things like online applications. Everything is an online application now, and it can be quite confusing. Also, you could discuss actually work on resumes, building a resume. What do resumes look like? What should I put on it? All of this stuff can be worked on while your student is in school. Another thing you can talk about with your student, and that's why we start this as early as possible. Age 14 is what the law says in Massachusetts, but if your student is 13 and you're talking about the IEP where they turn 14, you can start talking about self-determination. All of these things we're talking about, making choices about their work and what they want to do after school. It's self-determination and disability disclosure. Talk about what that is going to mean. How do they disclose their disability? Do they want to? Can they choose? Of course they can, but all these things have to be discussed before you get in the position of needing to do so. I know I've said a lot Should I go maybe to independent living and then see if we have any questions, or how are we doing on that? Is that fine? Okay. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we had the 3 big goals. I keep hitting those, but they're right there in IDEA. So how can you not? It's education, it's employment, and the last one is independent and community living. That's the so important piece of the planning an adult life, a meaningful adult life. You don't want your student to get their diploma or leave school and have everything stop. You want to think about the things that they like to do in high school, and you start to plan, how am I going to pursue that when I get out of school? So if I think I worked in a residential program before coming to the Federation, and we had a young man who was a brilliant musician. And when he graduated and he went back and moved in with his parents, or moved near his parents, they had already decided, the IEP team had decided that music was a really key part in his life. So they had set up a time for him to come on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoon, and he played piano at a local senior center. So it was a win-win for everyone. He absolutely loved music. He got to plan what he was going to play. It was also a chance for him to be out in the community. Those are the things that you start to think about. What are your students' strengths, and how can they take those strengths into the community to build a full and meaningful life? Also, things like social skills in school. How do they develop a friendship? How do they make friends? Do they know how to ask questions? Do they know how to listen? Things like that. For some people, we take that for granted, but some of our students really need the time and strategic planning to work on these things. There's also, in the community, you have to learn how to independently access community resources to the best of their potential. Not every student can do this, but we want to have high expectations. So how would they get to the library? How would they go to the bank? Do they know where their grocery store is going to be? Financial literacy. Do they know how to use a debit card? Will they be able to open an account and keep track of it, or they're going to need some help with that? Also, a big piece of transition to an adult life is understanding your students' healthcare needs, and they need to understand their own healthcare needs, because that's something else that changes once a student leaves high school and you start to get in your late teens, early 20s. All of a sudden, you have to think about, do you have a primary care physician lined up? It's not going to be your pediatrician anymore. Do you have meds? Do you know how to get the refills, or do you need help with that? All of these things need to be considered ahead of time. Other things also, like learning to use transportation. And will they be able to order an Uber when they need to, or are they going to be able to learn to drive? Recreational opportunities, we talked about that. Also, safety skills, right, in the community and online. Man, it's just everywhere. Understand your social media footprint. I have a daughter who's not on an IEP, and it's very hard for me to get the iPhone out of her hand. But to get this generation of young people to understand that the internet has a long memory, and it's going to live longer than you will. And so the things that you put out there, you don't know who's seeing it. So these are really important things to discuss. Okay, so I've hit the 3 big goals. We may have some questions or not. So you want to check in?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to what you were saying about the internet. That what I did with my kids that they seemed to quickly forget that we had done was I made them share a cloud with me.
Oh, nice.
So I would get notifications and I could see their pictures and things like that. So, and a few times it was really interesting. Shall we go to questions? Mary Beth, would you like to come on or open up your
Can I say one quick thing too?
Sure.
Something I figured out in terms of the internet, and you guys probably know this, I didn't know this, but your children can have fake Instagram accounts, or they can have one for you and then another one with a different name and a different picture for their friends. That was certainly a learning experience for me. So don't put anything past them. That's all I'm saying.
They can have fake anything accounts.
Yes.
But back in the day when my daughter had Facebook, she had
right.
Facebook
Yeah, I know I sound very naive, but I was truly shocked. Okay. Oh, sorry.
So we have two questions in the Q&A. We have a lot of comments in the chat. What I would ask people if they have questions to use the Q&A in the bottom of this, should be on the bottom of your screen, to pose questions, and those will be the questions that we will ask Rebecca. So this is the first question. With the current waiver of MCAS, many students now, quote unquote, meet district graduation requirements that would not otherwise. Does this mean they are no longer considered transition?
I'm going to let, do you have something on that, Eileen?
Well, my thought on that is they have transition goals, presumably in their IEPs. I mean, if they are meeting their transition goals, then they may be ready to graduate. It's going to be so individual. I mean, there are some kids who will not otherwise graduate because they would not be able to pass an MCAS. And in some situations, that's an opportunity this year to take. We don't know what's going to happen next year. We know that this year, English language arts and mathematics and science are all waived as competency requirements. Next year, we only know that science is waived. So, you know, that's going to be an individual decision, but they should not be pushed out if they have not achieved their transition objectives.
Yeah, it's really like new territory, right? But if your student has an IEP that has had these other goals, like these social skills and the voc training, that there are other things that we've talked about, right? This is not just the educational piece. These are the other pieces. Those are still valid. The MCAS doesn't comment on that. So if you are a part of that IEP team, you can still argue for or advocate for the continuation of services because the other pieces haven't, you know, okay, great. The MCAS has been waived, but the kid still needs voc training. The kid still needs to work on interviews, and you know, none of that has gone away. So I know, and also you can discuss compensatory services because we've all lost a year. You know, you can talk about that the kids have been online for a year, but we've all felt like we've all been just like slogging through a year full of a dumpster fire of a year. So it's a lot of people are arguing for compensatory services and just also saying, look, there's been a lack of progress, maybe not regression, but we've just sort of been, you know, treading water, status quo. And you kind of have to see if that works with your IEP team. And if not, then you call us or you call an advocate and we continue the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. So someone else asked, students with a disability and mixed immigration status would not have an employment opportunity as American citizen students will. How can we support their adult life if they're not able to be employed? I know that's a big question.
It is, and I would have to say, I'd have to talk to MRC about that because I remember reading something recently where I don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility. So I would really want to take that to MRC before I answered that.
Okay, so speaking of MRC, do residential schools have MRC counselors? And that question also comes up as far as technical vocational schools. If you can address that, that would be great. Particularly, there's several questions about that, so I will kind of lump those together.
Well, I know the program I worked at Perkins School for the Blind before coming here, and we did have, for students who are visually impaired, they do have pre-ETS programs through MRC, but it comes through the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind. So I feel like that is a thing. I think everybody has an MRC counselor, but I'm not 100% sure, and I can get that information for you and send it to you.
That would be great.
So I'll just need to make sure I know who that is, and we will get that information for you.
Okay. I will provide you with that.
Are you familiar with that, Eileen?
I am not familiar with the answer to that. I know individual schools who have had connections to pre-ETS, but I'm not sure that they're automatically assigned the way that your typical public school would be.
Okay.
Yep, I mean.
We'll find out, so we'll know for next time. Okay.
So another question had come up from for the same person who had asked that. Can a parent call an IEP meeting at any time when they have concerns about transition planning or lack thereof?
Absolutely. You can
Yeah.
always ask for another IEP meeting. You are an important member of that IEP team, as is your student.
What I might suggest too is that you can have a less formal meeting with some of the school staff around doing the transition planning form or revising it if you've done it in the past. And you and the student work on, coming up with a framework of the transition planning form, and then you have a meeting
Hmm.
that's informed by that form, and you can get it into the IEP. Okay. What happens when transitioning begins September 2021 and the student is 21 and a half years old? Yeah.
Yeah. We'd have to talk about that. I'm not sure.
I think, it's going to be obviously very individual,
Right.
depending on whether the student is planning to graduate or not, what their expectations are, what they're going to have for adult agency support, if any. But yeah, if that happens unfortunately, sometimes in the RTSC program, our SCSPs get assigned a child fairly late in the game. And yeah, it's very frustrating.
It is. And like you said, just as individualized as are the IEPs, every transition plan, not one student's transition plan is going to be the same as another's. But yes, that would be very frustrating. We can certainly, talk about that.
We have a individual that has stated that is it the school's responsibility to implement the transition plan? In our IEP, they have goals, but it seems like they are put the onus on him to meet them, just as if they were just statements. And it seems like other people have responded with the same response.
When you say him, do you mean the student or the?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a team effort. There's supposed to be an MRC counselor. There are supposed to be the teachers and the service providers are all supposed to come together around this student to help build. You take the student's vision, but they're supposed to be helping you to create that vision. I mean, as an IEP, you don't write it for the kid and then say, okay, these are your special education services, go out there and get them. That's really not the point. And I know that happens. I'm not trying to be glib about that. That's frustrating to me as a parent. So yeah, I would want the providers and the teachers to take it seriously and to understand that it is a team effort.
Mm-hmm.
That they all have to work together in support of the student.
I mean, I've seen times where the transition planning form has had some fairly vague things written.
Sure.
That seem like, Jimmy will learn to drive kind of thing. But
right.
That's why we have to get into very specific measurable goals in the IEP, because then it has to be supported by the planning grid where we can figure out who's doing what and when, and it's not just the student's responsibility. Is the short answer. Exactly. If a student is 18 years old and in his last partial inclusion in general education with an intellectual disability, should he begin transition program at MAICE site? High school is creating the transition program, but it's not meeting the needs of travel training, job search, work exploration, self-determination skills. Also, is it the school's responsible for MRC's pre-ETs?
Okay, so there should be an MRC counselor with the school. Some of these specifics, I know that the Macy programs when you get to like the really granular thing for your individual student, it would be great. You could reach out to us and we can answer those questions for you more thoroughly. Because I think that's more detailed than, you know, what you're going to get in a presentation. And I would like to get you the right information.
Okay, there seems to be several questions regarding transition programs to start in senior year. And I think it's important that we, you know, reiterate that it's supposed to start at the age of 14. And even for some students, as kids in DCF custody, it may need to start earlier than that.
Absolutely, and it can start as early as the IEP team agrees that it can. So if you are an SESP or you are a parent and you feel like my student is going to need longer time, then bring that up at your IEP meeting. That's absolutely valid.
Yep. So
and I would say too that if transition goals are in place and are not being met, you know, that's potentially grounds for moving a graduation date, but you don't really want to leave it till senior year unless, you know, you're handed it, obviously, because at the NSCSP may come into that role. But schools, the closer it gets to graduation, the less the school is going to be willing to move the date.
And I just want to, someone asked a question in the chat. The presentation will be emailed out after the webinar is completed, and the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our site, RTSC's site afterwards. So if you want to have a chance, you can go ahead and read that. Let me just pull up, there's also, I'm not sure why I'm not, I have a hand raised, and that's why I want to look at who has raised their hand.
May I also suggest that we may want to go on, because I know that Rebecca.
So whoever has raised their hand, if they could, in fact, just type something in the chat, because I now can't find you. That would be great.
Yeah, we do have a little bit more to go on, but I do want to say to the parents and teachers and SESPs, caregivers out there, I'm also in the same position, and I understand that it's overwhelming and it's frustrating, and you're trying to get information to support your loved one. And that's why we're here to help. So if you do have specific questions, we will give you our information and you reach out to us and we will walk you through it. It's a lot, and you don't have to do it alone. And there are a lot of decisions, but it's also, there's not that many decisions if you think about it, and that you're making it highly individualized for your student. So the better you know your student and the more communication you have with them, the closer you're going to get to the answers that you need to help them start to build their life. Yeah, so, you know, we're not going anywhere after this webinar. So just to confirm that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is such a bummer because we were just talking about how tough this is. Why is transition so important? The statistics are grim. You guys are watching this webinar, so you know that the statistics are grim. That's why you're here, trying to get more information. Historically, students with IEPs graduate far at a lesser rate than students who are not on IEPs. Students with disabilities, people with disabilities are underemployed or unemployed. And when they are unemployed, it affects their independence. It affects their ability to be independent. So that's why we're here. These numbers have been the same for decades, and that's why we're working on transition now, because we're trying to change it. The more skills that they can get in high school, the soft skills, the training, the vocational training, the academics, then the work readiness, then they're going to be better prepared as young adults, and that will hopefully influence their success. We're trying to do it one kid at a time, and that's why you're here, and I salute you for that. Next slide, please. So, are you overwhelmed yet? I am, as a parent. So timelines, there are these great timelines that are valuable planning tools. No, it doesn't help you if your student is being offered something at the age of 21. I totally get that. But for the people who have students who are much younger, there are these great timelines. We have a lot at our FCSN at the Link Center. You can look them up, but this is a great one. The ARC of Massachusetts has one, and that's the link for it. Timelines can be really helpful from helping you feel overwhelmed. You don't have to know everything the very first year. You don't have to know everything the second year. This helps you prioritize some of the decisions that you need to make depending upon the age your child or your student is. And if you look at that particular place on the timeline, you see, oh my gosh, we haven't done that yet, then you know that's what you work on. It's not a big deal. It's a work in progress. So I can give you some examples from this timeline. If your student is maybe age 13 or 14, a couple of things you'll find on this are to provide opportunities for them to see people at work in different settings, to allow them as much independence as possible, to assign responsibility for certain chores, to sort of instill a work ethic. And if you look at age 16 and 17, you should be considering their first job experience if they don't have a job already. One of the biggest indicators for success for young people with disabilities and without disabilities is if they have a job in high school. If they have a job in high school, then it's a bigger indicator that they can be employed when they're out of high school. So also age 16 and 17, it says you could encourage relationships and nurture friendships. So things like that. It's not as daunting as it seems when you get down and read the details, but it's just the process seems so overwhelming. And that's why it's great to start early if you can, and planning ahead is important. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the beauty of transition planning, it's driven by the student's vision. It's his or her or their own vision of what they think is a full and meaningful life. And that is a really beautiful thing if you think about it. Before the age of 14, they have IEPs where we're looking at what their skills are, what maybe their weaknesses are, and how we can work and build that up. But once you start thinking about transition planning at the age of 14, you start to think about the student's strengths and the things that they like to do and their interests, and how we can support them, how the team can support them in the things that they like to do or that they're interested in. Once a student turns 14, it should be as close as 100% of what the student wants to do, and the team honors that. It might change every year, and it should, because teenagers grow and they get more experiences. They might think that they want to work at the zoo, and then they volunteer at the zoo over the summer and decide it's hot and stinky and they don't want to work at the zoo. Things happen. It's a work in progress, because once the student is learning and exploring, then they change. None of us is the same person today that we were at the age of 14. And it might be hard to get your student or your child to engage in these discussions. I know that when I try to have these discussions, sometimes I get an eye roll and silence. So you can start with a graphic like this. If your student is nonverbal and can't discuss with you, well, then you look at what are his or her favorite things. What recreation activities do they enjoy? And there are ways that you can present that to your IEP team. It doesn't have to be one way. That's sort of the beauty of it, is what works for your student. And you can ask them, what are your favorite things? And if they won't tell you, then observe them. You could also ask them, what don't you want? Sometimes a way to find out what is going to work for your student is they might not be able to tell you what they like, but they can absolutely tell you what they don't like and what they don't want. So maybe they don't want to work at home or live at home for the rest of their lives. Or maybe they don't want to work outside, but they want to work inside because they like computers. I mean, you can start from there, and you can, really go into the details of that. But just trying to initiate that communication, you get them to start thinking about their goals for themselves and start to think about the things that they like, because they are going to have to get comfortable making choices for themselves and explaining those choices to other people.
Can I just add, I know you're going to talk about transition assessments, and sometimes that's a place to start. If a transition assessment has been done and you can access that information for your student to kind of help narrow down both things that they're capable of and things that they're interested in.
Sure.
And that's something the school can do. That's something pre-eds can help with.
Right. And we will talk about that. This really is the, if you can get the student to start thinking about what's going on, what their interests are. I can tell you about a student that I worked with, who was this big outgoing guy who really loved phones, and he really loved talking to people. It was just something that gave him great joy. And his IEP team were trying to think, well, how can we structure something for him around these interests? And they went to the local Y, and the Y had him come in, and he volunteered once a week, and he made phone calls to all of the Y members whose birthdays it was. So he was absolutely in heaven because he got to use the phone and he got to talk to people. So it's that kind of things. It's really observing your student and having them tell you what they enjoy doing, and then sort of, thinking, being creative and imaginative, and thinking about, well, where can this take us? You'd be surprised. Next slide. Okay, so the student's vision. This is all about these great keywords: self-determination and self-advocacy. Making choices and decisions based on their own preferences and interests is self-determination. It's just the thought of what I prefer, what I like. That's self-determination. It doesn't have to be some big term that people think, I don't know what that is. It's just knowing yourself and knowing what you like. Self-advocacy is when you put a voice to those decisions, to those thoughts. It's letting people know how you feel about things, and what you want, and the choices that you want. It's letting them know. And these skills need to be taught and practiced at home. When they're young, if it's the difference between deciding what you want for dinner or choosing what shirt you're going to wear that day, that's where you start making decisions, to where you're going to go out to eat, or which movie are you going to, maybe it's my turn to decide. And then as they get older, you give them a chance to make more decisions, so that then when they are a young adult, that they're accustomed to that. They're accustomed to telling people what their decisions are, and making them. And all youth need opportunities to problem solve and to make mistakes. And for the youth in DCF custody, as you know, they have fewer opportunities to practice these skills. So maybe if you are an SESP, you might think about or talk to the folks at the residential programs about how to give them the chance to do that, to make more decisions. Where I worked, when it was a Thursday, we would always say, well, we'd have a cottage meeting, and we'd say, what's your plan? What's your plan for the weekend? So that they had to start thinking about, okay, in 2 days, if I want to do anything, I have to start thinking about what it is, because we have to call and find out if they're open and figure out how to get there. And that was just what we did. We made it the thing. If the weekend was coming up, what's your plan? If you were home from school, what's your plan? And when do you get your chores done? That was always in the conversation that we would have with the students, to get them thinking, oh, I need to have a plan about how my day is going, and that evolves into how my life is going. Next slide, please. Okay, so we sort of touched on this, but it is the student's role in transition planning, and I just sort of fit in there. This is self-advocacy. This is self-determination. We want them to practice these skills. We want them to become second nature as much as is humanly possible. Our kids who have disabilities have had people telling them what to do and where to go and how high to jump or how high to try to jump, from the time that they were very small. So I don't take any of this for granted. That's why they need more time to practice. And it is so important, because it's their life that we're planning. Next slide, please. Okay, so talking about transition assessments. It is written in IDEA. Let me make sure I get that. And what it says in IDEA, that they need to be measurable, they need to be age appropriate, and that's about it. It's pretty vague. The Division of Career Development at the Council for Exceptional Children describes it as transition as ongoing evaluations looking at a student's interests, preferences, and needs as they relate to current and future working, educational, living, and social environments. So you have a wide variety of things that can be considered a transition assessment. If you think about it, every test or every assessment that your student is given after the age of 14 can be considered a transition assessment. It could be something as formal as an academic test like the MCAS, or an intelligence test, or a vocational interest test. It can be something as informal as interviewing a teacher, or an observation, or having a conversation with your student, or having them, like you were mentioning, Eileen, going through their own vocational interest assessment. There are all kinds of things. So you do better when you start with the student. You might have a student who's academically right where they need to be, but maybe doesn't have the vocational skills, or maybe doesn't have the social skills. And you might ask your IEP team about assessing that way. Or you might have a student who's not going to be academically, is not going to take an MCAS. And so you're looking at life skills and things that you need to look at in terms of assessment to get them as independent as possible for when they finally leave their program. Do you have anything you want to add about that, Eileen? No? Okay. So here's the thing. There's not like one magic test. There's not like a box of tests that you can do and say, oh, now I got you pegged. No one test that's going to give you all the answers about every student. So it's always better if you know your student. So look at them, right, and see where you think their strengths are, where you think challenges that you might need to support to help them create their vision. And then you talk to your IEP team about how do we assess this? And also just what you're observing and what your teachers are observing. You can get great information about, can your student sit still for 10 minutes? Is your student going to be able to work for up to 4 hours? Is your student going to be able to learn to drive? These are things that if you don't know the answers to that, but you want those, you can discuss that with your IEP team and figure out how to assess for that.
Rebecca, I have a question. This is Bridget.
Hi.
So I see a question in the Q&A. Advice for parents when the parent requests vocational assessment and the school responds that they don't do that type of testing. I have an answer for that, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
So they should have an MRC counselor, and they do that. I mean, that's the point.
I think when there isn't an MRC, and we're starting to have this conversation, you've made a request and the school has denied your request. So what I would suggest is you make sure that's on the N1, that prior written notice, so that they can respond with why they're refusing that testing. Because we don't do that here is not necessarily a regulation.
Absolutely.
So I think your best bet is to get their response in writing, and then the Massachusetts has a great list of assessments that we have in our training that we can certainly get out to people. That sometimes the school doesn't know what tests to do. And so unfortunately, part of our responsibility is helping them see that.
Right. And they're going to hope that they'll tell you no, and that that's where that will end the conversation. So this is a good thing. That's why the Federation has your back, because there are details about this that I haven't gotten to fine tuning yet. So thank you so much.
I'll put a link to those assessments.
I think sometimes. Oh, go ahead, Bridget. No, you go.
I can put a link in the chat for those assessments.
I just wanted to say regarding that, I think sometimes schools lean on MRC and think that pre-ETS, and sometimes pre-ETS does things very well and that's satisfactory, but it's still the school's responsibility is the bottom line. Okay. And whether, they should never be saying we don't do vocational assessments. So, that's something to negotiate with them. You can certainly, I mean, if they're refusing to do it and it goes in the N1, as Bridget said, they have to explain exactly why they refuse a request to a team meeting. And sometimes that really shines the spotlight on something they might not want the spotlight on. So, I'm going to say it's about 21 minutes after 1.
Right.
So, and this is flying by so fast. Shall we take questions? I think that's probably, or did you want to try to do more and then take a few questions? What would you prefer, Rebecca?
Well, we talked about, I think, could we talk a little bit about the transition planning form. So it's
see that.
we have a lot of information here, and that is the thing.
And you are all getting this as a resource, the whole presentation.
Yeah.
And if we could maybe, Eileen, I'll put my face up here. Maybe what we can do with information, because I know we have a hard stop at 1:30, is on our Facebook page for RTSC, we can post some of the answers that Rebecca, you had said you were going to dig a little deeper into, so that we'll have that opportunity. I'll put a link to our Facebook page on here as well.
That's a great idea, Bridget. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we could just go, there is a lot of information here, and you know, an hour is not enough time to really touch on it. So we can absolutely get that to you. I would like to, can we move to just slide 21, I think? Oh, oh, sorry, that's 17. Can you go forward a couple, because we'll
Keep
just
going. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, the transition planning form. So we talked about the student's vision. There is a form, that's the transition planning form, that you can know about and you can ask for if it's not offered to you. It's sort of like a graphic organizer that can help you put your student's vision and start to think about where you're going to put that in the IEP. It's important that you know, you can go to the next one, please, Emma, that the transition planning form is not a legal document. It's the IEP that is the legal document. Nothing on the transition planning form is mandated to occur. So you can use it as a way to get thoughts on paper and think about your action plan. But you want, like, the post-secondary vision that's in your transition planning form should go in the IEP 1 as the vision statement. You want to, it needs to be completed before you draft the IEP. So you can always sit down with your student and go over what the vision is and where you want to put things. In the IEP 2, you have the general curriculum. That's where the student is now. That's the present level of educational performance. But the PLEP B is where is the sweet spot for transition, for the things that your student may need that's beyond academics. And that's where that goes. It's travel training, it's other educational needs, extracurricular activities, social, emotional needs. I mean, how you talk to others, what kind of a friend you are. Those are things kids can learn, and they can learn that in school. Vocational skill development. So don't ignore that part. I think that's a really important part of the IEP. I just wanted to sort of hit on that. And then if we go to the next one. And just to be thinking about, as early as you can, always be discussing the anticipated graduation date. If your student is on track to graduate, and maybe they will graduate in 4 years, is that enough time for you? Or are you going to advocate for more time so that your student can work on some of these other issues, these other areas that we've been discussing? We were talking to a group of young people, young advocates, a couple of weeks ago, and we asked them what they would say to students who are going through transition right now. And one young man said, I would want them to know when they're going to graduate. He said he thought he was going to graduate with all of his friends, and he was surprised that he's not going to graduate for another year. So he didn't even get to walk. I mean, technically he should have been able to walk with his class, but it was just something he left school with a really bad taste in his mouth, because he felt like that was his surprise. So that's just something I would caution you about. Also, the recommendation for a Chapter 688 referral should happen if your student is going to leave school at the age of 22. Around the age of 20 is when you need to talk to your IEP team about getting referred to an adult services agency so that they're ready for them. Okay, so I know so much more. We have some great resources that are at the end of this particular presentation. Can we go to the, let's see, fast forward a little bit? Yeah, right, okay, right here. So can you go back one, Emma? Thank you. Okay, so you have the transitions, the website at the Federation. A lot of these resources are there. There is the Family Guide to Transition Services in Massachusetts. It's about 40 pages, and you can sit down with this little booklet and go through it with your student to start thinking about these things. There's a great listserv. There's also this really great on Facebook. You have to it's private, so you have to ask them to get in, but it's the Massachusetts Transition to Adulthood. So many parents there, so many people who are maybe a little bit ahead on the journey and can answer some questions for you. It's a wonderful resource. And also one more resource that I'm going to suggest. Miss Emma, can we go forward one? Yeah, the tips brochures. So the Federation, my predecessor, Nancy Mader, with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, made these incredible brochures. There's something on everything: transition planning, transition assessment, self-determination, disability disclosure, for students on the autism spectrum, with
And in
ASD.
multiple languages.
Oh yes, in like 5 different languages. They're incredible resources. So you can go and get PDF versions. I have the link there. And those are great to sit down, and it's a quick read, but it gives you like really great basic information, and you can take them to your IEP meeting. If someone says we don't do that, you hand them the brochure that says, but oh yes, you do, or maybe you should. You know, it just continues the conversation. So I'm so sorry we had to fast forward through that, but you know, we will continue the conversation, and I will let Eileen, if you want to get some questions, or have I? Oh, we've got 2 minutes.
I think one thing Eileen, can I jump in just real quick?
Sure.
So the hopefully we'll be able to share this presentation as a live document so that you can click on these links and get to these links. And I think that will be sent out after.
Yeah, I will be sending that out after the webinar is finished.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mary Beth, do you want to?
Mary Beth has left the building.
Oh, okay.
So I am here. And if we look at some questions, I think what is holding people accountable, let me see.
And we're going to look through the questions.
Okay.
Emma, can we be sure to save the Q&A, and we'll look through them and make sure we
Yes.
get them answered on our Facebook page, because as Rebecca said, this is a huge topic, and you know, it's really hard to cover. Well, you know, the Link Center where Rebecca is now sitting has previously done up to 2-day classes on this. So
Right.
it's
One
really,
thing I would
it's-
like to address, one
Mhm.
question was, part of the issue, I think part of the issue is the time discrepancy between transition planning and the year-to-year time of the actual IEP. And what I would say to that is you can call a transition meeting, a meeting that's specific, that doesn't necessarily go into that 3-year, 1-year timeline. At any point in time, you have the right to call a meeting. And this would be a specific for transition so that everyone knows that's what the goal is.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, for that particular topic, it's probably a good idea to do that at least once a year, because things do change. And like what you put in your transition planning form might change 6 months down the line, or change within the year.
Mhm.
And also, if you want to put, for the folks who are listening, if there are things you want to know more about, you could put that in the Q&A. So that helps us decide what we plan and what we offer for upcoming presentations.
Maybe we have someone from MRC
That sounds
come
great.
in
Yeah,
and be part of the conversation so that we
absolutely.
have those responses.
There's so much to cover. We could focus in on sections, and if
Right,
people can let us
absolutely.
know what your greatest area of interest is, that'd be real help.
Right.
Great. Do we have time for any more questions? I think we're probably just about, and it turned 1:30. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry to leave questions unanswered, and I'm sorry to have to cut off Rebecca's wonderful presentation, but we will post on our Facebook page that Bridget has put in the chat. And we're really happy that you joined us. And thank you so much, Rebecca Davis, for
Thank
giving
you.
us all this wonderful information. And yeah, I think it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely. And thank you to everybody who's listening. And you're not alone, so reach out to us. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.